Hello, it's Philip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chambers in London. Today I'm looking at a book which has come to me from Brian Harris, and this is one of two recordings that I'm going to do about the books he's writing so far on his favourite author, Rudyard Kipling. Now, Brian Harris and I have corresponded for some years now over other matters, we're both lawyers. This particular book, though, the one I'm looking at today, is called The Two-Sided Man, and it's a selection of short stories of Rudyard Kipling, which have been brought together by Brian Harris in this book. This is the book here. Before we look at the book, I'll just tell you, Elizabeth and I talked about this, so I've actually written the main review in most part. I gave it a title for the review, A Few Jewels in the Amazing Treasure Chest of Rudyard's Exceedingly Good Prose. Now, whether you like Rudyard Kipling or not, I think is actually beside the point. I think he's one of the greats. And I personally have been influenced by quite a lot, as I think many people have, quite a lot of what he's written. Now, let's have a look at the book first of all. A nice cover written by Brian's, I think his daughter. There's the spine and then there's the back. The book itself it runs to 400 odd pages. There's a lot of stuff that's taken out of it, of course, taken out of the quotes. But the bit that's most important, if I go to the front, is there's some other books by Brian which are mentioned there. This, as I say, is part of, there was an earlier book that he's written. This is called The Two-Sided Man. And of course, as I've indicated, there was an earlier book which was called The Surprising Mr. Kipling, which I'm reviewing separately. And I've also reviewed Tales from the Courtroom, which Brian has written, and Passion, Poison and Power, and Intolerance, I think, as well, over the years. It's been a long time. That's the contents section there, showing what he's actually selected. Then there are acknowledgements about what he's been, who's helped him. Then a list of the stories, and then there's a quote. I'm going to read that right at the end, that quote there, because it's quite poignant. There's a list of stories that he's got. You can see them. Some of them you may know. Some of them I did, some of them I didn't. So I've learnt a little bit, of course. So I have a learning outcome with this. Kipling short stories, an introductory essay. And this is really where Brian comes into his own by setting out why he's written this and explaining quite a lot of the stuff. There's not a great deal before we actually go into the stories themselves. But it's just that little section there. You can see it's April 2015 is when he wrote this. And I'm recording this in June 2015, so it's not that long ago. But in fact, it sets out quite clearly here various points that he wants to make about some of the stories and their relevance, which I think is quite good. And he quotes quite a few people. This is a highly scholastic, in my view, approach in terms of what Brian has said before he looks at the selection of the short stories. But I think it puts Kipling more in a modern perspective, if I can put it that way, for people new to him in the 21st century, because obviously he spans a couple of centuries now, and such a different era. This is what we say anyway. Brian Harris has clearly held a long, cherished wish to produce a very detailed and highly personal account of where he sees the great Rudyard Kipling in the overall scheme of English literature. And to this end, Harris's latest offering is The Two-Sided Man, this book here, which is his selection of 16 of Kipling's short stories, the most well-known of which is The Man Who Would Be King, which is on page 53 onwards, which has been made into a most haunting, well-told film by John Huston, starring Michael Caine and Sean Connery. And I'm sure many people have seen that film, which I thought was extremely well made. And it's a very interesting story because I suspect it's probably got an awful lot of truth behind it, as most of these stories normally do. They can be anecdotal, but I suspect there's a lot of fact in some of them. In fact, and remember that the stories are not quite like the film at all, but that's always the way with these film people. They do change things a lot to make it even more visually appetising. Now, in fact, the anthology, let's get back to it, which we're talking about, is a splendid cross-section of Kipling's literary output for a writer who supposedly dropped out of modern literature some years ago. Of particular note is a comment by Somerset Maugham, who described Kipling as our greatest short story writer. I can't believe he will ever be equalled, and he hasn't. And this is a pretty good comment coming from Willie, describing Kipling's incomparable procession of short stories spread over the years, whilst retaining lasting merit from beginning to end, because Somerset Maugham, in his lifetime, certainly was absolutely right at the top, and he has whatever you think of him as a guy, he really was a beautiful explainer of stories which he picked up on all his travels. Likewise with Kipling, although Kipling is very much, of course, associated with one particular subcontinent. I think Harris is to be congratulated on his painstakingly careful selection of these fascinating stories, which come to a new audience so many years after their original appearance, some of which I didn't know about either, which I'm glad to have actually had shown to me, because it gives me a broader perspective. Of course, the exclusion of some stories, always the bane of a selector's existence, is a decision Brian deflects brilliantly with his offer to reread omitted stories from comments made by readers as to their future inclusion, in the hope of achieving the enlightenment for which Kim's Lama yearned. Yes, we had to check Kim to understand this one as well. Just Google it if you've got a problem. Harris also puts in some form of timeline for the stories, which I found helpful, arranging them in the order of the publication of the volumes in which the stories were first collected. It gives us as the readers some idea of contemporaneity during Kipling's lifetime. Great help are the thoughts Brian gives on the significance of the stories at the end of the extracts, covering what he calls the more cryptic aspects, and where appropriate the finer points of the language used. Always a help, of course, when reading Kipling. Anthologies are useful publications to be dipped into, so the short teasers which Brian adds to the list of the contents at the beginning of the book are most helpful. I found them really interesting, I must say. They don't give away the details of the plots, so you'll be relieved to know that. His thoughts at the end of the story are also very revealing, and at the back there's a useful bibliography which will be of great interest to Kipling scholars. Now, I do actually belong to that school of thought that says sometimes with a poem or a short story, it's nice to have a little bit of explanation. I'm thinking of Auden and a few other people, where sometimes you look at the poem and you can't understand what the man's talking about. So you do need sometimes to have a little bit of explanation, then it all becomes clear, or clearer, and I think Brian does a very good job there because he's a master at the actually explaining things. So at one time, let's take the 60s, 70s, 80s, etc., it was thought the age of the short storyteller was at an end, and probably every time any aspiring author sends the manuscript in, unsolicited of course, to a big publisher, replies in the usual way to get rid of you and say no. And of course the usual rubbish comes out, because at the end of the day they publish an awful lot of rubbish, and I'm sure a lot of gems are not published, but that's life. And the thing is, today we've got the internet and we've got our own way of publishing books, and I'm very glad to have them. It just adds to the sum of human knowledge. Happily, as many recent writers can confirm, Mortimer, etc., this is not the case now, of course, with these gems disappearing. It never really was, because we, I think, must recognise that we can delight in welcoming Brian Harris's collection, The Two-Sided Man. I know he's published it presumably himself, I don't know, but it's a wonderful contribution to the world of literature in my view. The final word really being here is, where did the title come from? And it's the quote. And I've got it in the book review, but I'm going to quote it here as well, because it's a nice little piece of poetry. It's there. You can see it there. It's, "Much I owe to the lands that grew, more to the lives that fed, but most to Allah, who gave me two separate sides to my head." interesting. And on that, I will conclude. But I'm going to say one thing, and that is thank you, Brian. You've done an awful lot of work. I don't know about the Kipling Society. I'm not a member of it. I hope they know about all of this, because I think you obviously love the subject matter. I hope these are available at Kipling's house as well, because I have been there, and it's well worth a visit. You get a feel for the man and what he did. Thank you anyway to all concerned to encourage us and enrich us a bit more. That's what you did with us. Thank you. Bye.